Brian. He's the lead dog in our group, and we've got a bunch of really great colleagues there. Louise Loudermilk, Dexter Strother, Marcus Williams, and Yong Kyung Lu, who does a bunch of smoke modeling, which is pertinent to some of the stuff that's been talked about today too. And I'll probably try to bring threads of everything that all of us do together in this presentation, because really soil is maybe the most important thing that we have to manage as land managers. And I'm biased, I'll admit that, because I've been raised in the soil sciences, and so I've got a little bit of a soil-centric view, and I hope I'll convince y'all that this is a thing that we really do need to be thinking about, particularly in places where there's large accumulations of organic matter on the surface of the soil. All right, so the outline for the talk, I like to check in with folks every now and then, just kind of tell you why I'm here and what we're talking about, why we're talking about it. So we'll talk about why soil for a little while, and particularly that stuff that's called duff on the surface of the soil. Soil scientists call it the O horizon. We'll get into that. Why fire is probably a question that doesn't need to be asked in this room, but hopefully I can provide maybe a little bit of context that some of you haven't been exposed to before in terms of why we even think prescribed fire is so important. And I hope to make the argument that it's not just ecologically important, but in the Southeast and really across the entire continent, it's culturally important as well. And then I'll talk about a couple of different studies, and I want to contrast fire effects on soil in a wildfire scenario with fire effects in a prescribed fire scenario. So that's where we're going. I also wanted to say that this is like a real dream come true for me, because I grew up in Georgia. I don't know how many of y'all are native Georgians, but this is like, you know, you're my people. So I feel like this is a safe space, and I hope you'll keep your rotten tomatoes on that side of the room. All right, so why soil? Why are we talking about duff? Okay, and so what I would say to you is that soil is maybe, you know, we could debate this, but maybe the most important of the natural resources. It's certainly up there with things like air and water in terms of its importance, because without soil, we really don't have any kind of forest to manage. So that's point number one. The other thing that people tend to forget about soil is that it's this living, dynamic, biological reactor that everything is situated on. Most people think about soil as just like, this is just a static entity. It's the place where plants grow, and that's all they think about. But the truth is that soil is very dynamic. It's mostly alive, made up of organic matter and mineral particles and water, and it's responsive. So we know through years and years of research that the things that we do to the land impact the quality and the health of soil. And so it behooves us to understand what our management actions are doing. And then from a more of a conservation and ethical and aesthetic standpoint, we have to recognize that soil is really this amazing reservoir of biological diversity. And again, that's something that it behooves us to take good care of as managers of land, because it provides lots of services. So when I was, many years ago, I was a judge for the state science fair, where they had all the little kids who had their posters set up in the Stegeman Coliseum on the Athens campus at UGA. And one of the kids, I was judging soil-related projects, and the title that this kid had was just perfect, and I use it all the time. Soil. Without it, we'd be naked, starving, and cold or wet. I can't remember what it was. But it's true, right? Everything we use comes from soil. All right, so this is really preaching to the choir here, but just want to talk and put into context a little bit why we want to talk about fire in the first place. So we know, extremely important factor in the shaping of the ecosystems of North American continent, probably the world really, but in North America in particular, at least since the time of the glaciers, and probably before that. We're going to talk about a lot of this later. And we know that fire, and we've been hearing about it all day long, fire influences the vegetation that occurs in a place. It influences nutrient dynamics, interacts with climate, and it has a long human history in this part of the world as well. So I want to just hit on a few high notes in that regard too. Try to give some context. So we've seen part of this map for Georgia already today. This is Rich Guyat's projection. This is not actual fire return interval, okay? What this is the potential fire return interval that the vegetation and climate combination in a particular place will support, okay? And so you can see, if I can find the pointer, so you can see in the state of Georgia and across most of the Southeast, we're talking about every other year or every 4 years or something like that. That's not the actual measured return interval, right? That's just how much the vegetation can support in terms of production of fuel. And if we had an infinite number of ignition sources, it would burn that often, could, okay? But the message that I take from this is that the vegetation wants to burn. Like it's made to burn. It's been evolutionarily selected for fire. So again, y'all probably don't need me to tell you this, but I think it's important. And if we go back into the pollen record, this is from Anderson Pond. They took these cores in Anderson Pond, which is kind of north central Tennessee, and they looked at the pollen that had developed in the strata of the sediment in that pond. And so this goes back to the time of the glaciers, right? Everything was under, at least where the glaciers happened, like stopping at where the Ohio River comes in and where the Missouri River come in. Everything above that was ice, right? So 25,000 years ago, most of our pollen was consistent with boreal forest. That's something people don't think about much. Like Tennessee was boreal forest only 25,000 years ago. And that's another thing that soils people, they tend to think in really long spans of time. 25,000 years, not really that long. So then the glaciers retreated. There's a little hiatus in the amount of sedimentation that happened. But when the sediment started being formed again, the thing that you notice is there's lots of oak pollen. So we've already converted into an oak forest. And that coincides with this dramatic pulse in charcoal, right? So we know that there's the charcoal signature. So we know that charcoal and Quercus are strongly related with each other. What else happened about 8,000 years ago in that part of the world? Human beings, right? That was when we have the first recorded, or it's consistent with the first recorded record of human habitation of the Southeast. So what we like to argue in our group is that human beings have been setting the woods on fire, and the evidence is right here, for at least 8,000 years. That cultural use of fire has been really important. And probably since before that happened, it was a different kind of vegetation. We think that the interaction between human beings and the vegetation that ultimately resulted, these oak forests and pine forests of the Southeast, they're anthropogenic, they're human caused. And people don't like to think about that, but that's true, we think. All right, so more evidence of the human impact. I don't know, this is getting a little bit historical, so sciencey and historical. This guy, John Lawson, was the first English-speaking explorer to go through the Carolinas. So Charleston was founded about 1670, and 30 years after that, this guy, as a knucklehead 22-year-old, decided that he was going to go and essentially what he was a land speculator. So he wanted to go into the interior, travel through there, kind of make notes about natural history, natural resources, and the people that he encountered. And so just with regard to season of burn, I think this is really interesting. In January of 1701, we traveled about 20 miles along a savanna that was overflown with water. We were running short of victuals, which means they didn't plan their excursion very well. They're only 2 weeks into their excursion, right? But finding that the woods were newly burnt and on fire in many places gave us great hope that Indians were nearby, right? So there's a lot to unpack there, in my opinion, right? So first of all, they expected the Indians to help them, right? And they did throughout the whole thing. You should read this book. Well, the book that you should read is the one called In a Delicious Country, Rediscovering the Carolinas Along the Route. So that's by a guy at NC State, Scott Hewler. It's a lot easier to read than Lawson's own book. Lawson got a lot of things wrong about natural history, for example, but he did make an important record of the people that he ran into, and they uniformly, routinely helped them along the way of their journey. So he started in Charleston, came out around, went all the way up to the Blue Ridge, up and then over and came out around Wilmington. So a pretty impressive thing to do. But he met an untimely end after the Indians figured out what he was doing. They ended up putting him out of his misery around a campfire one night. Several years later, about 7 years later. Okay, so for our purposes though, the woods were on fire in January. So that suggests to me that the native people didn't know about season of burn. Every day was a burn day for them. And they had cultural reasons for doing that. They set the woods on fire at particular times, in particular places, for particular reasons. And they have been doing it for millennia. And we can do that too. We can have our reasons for doing it. So I would encourage you all to set the woods on fire and help any wayward travelers that you might run into. All right, so where we are now is, we love to show this slide. This is data from 2018, but we like to show that this cultural tradition of burning the woods in the Southeast persists, right? It's done mostly by white people now and land managers, not by the native folks, but it persists. And in my opinion, is that that's because we had a much closer and more symbiotic relationship with the native people in this part of the country than we did out here, right? There's a lot of great, interesting historical stuff that's been written about this, but I would say that this is something that we ought to be proud of. We burn more acres in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama on purpose than they burn by accident in California and Nevada most years, right? Okay, so obviously it's very important. Prescribed fire is a very important land management tool in the Southeast. Okay, so if you're going to study soil and you're going to study fire, it really, and particularly prescribed fire, it pays to pay really close attention to this O horizon. How many of y'all have had a soils class in your history? Looks like about a third, maybe. So we'll go through this. In forested systems, right, you get leaf litter that lands every year. In pine systems, it's more like a drizzle that happens throughout the year. In deciduous systems, it all happens at one time, right, in the fall. And if you don't burn it, then you wind up with an accumulation of that organic material, right? And it forms in predictable layers. So you have, at the top of that organic horizon, you've got brand new litter. And then below that, you've got partially decomposed stuff. We call that the OE or the F, the fermentation layer. That's where you can still recognize the particles. You can say, oh yeah, that's a leaf, but it doesn't look much like a leaf. And then below that, you've got this OA, very highly decomposed. Some people call it humus. And that's just the black spongy stuff that you see. You can see it, you know it's organic, but you can't tell what species it came from, for example. You can't see any recognizable plant parts anymore. Everybody good with that definition? So in the mineral soil horizons, particularly in prescribed fire situations, we can forget about it. Fire doesn't do anything to that. There's no negative consequence or positive, really, of using prescribed fire. In this horizon, very short-term, minor differences happen when you burn a place. But for the most part, we know that soils are well adapted, well buffered against the effects of prescribed fire. But wildfire versus prescribed fire, how you deal with this material does make a big difference. And so that's the focus of the research that we've been doing in our group that pertains directly to soil for the last few years. So start with the wildfire scenario. This is my colleague, Melanie Taylor, and really most of what you're going to see today is her work. I've been helping, but she's been doing the lion's share of the heavy lifting. So most of you probably remember that we had fires in 2016. I was glad that Johnny earlier mentioned the switch from El Nino to La Nina. The last time that happened in a major way was 2016. So just kind of like, I'm not guaranteeing it's going to be a dry fall, but there's a good chance. All right, so let's look at what it looked like in 2016. This is the US Drought Monitor for November 22nd of 2016. You can see that there was a very, very dry period, like heavy drought, centered over the Southern Appalachian region on that day. And that wasn't just that day, it took months to develop. And if my memory is good, it didn't rain a single drop for about 90 days that fall. So we had a situation where things were pretty dry. So I like to show this data. This is from Steve Norman, who works in the Eastern Forest Environmental Threats Assessment Center in Asheville, North Carolina. So what Steve did is he took percent of average stream flow and he plotted it against the average maximum temperature of the day for the fall, October through November conditions for these 50 years. Coincidentally, I was born in 1970, so this is my lifetime, up to 46. So the white dots are 1970 to 85, red dots 86 to 2000, and the black dots are 2001 to 2016. And so what you see is that in this dry to wet and cold to hot space, data space, you got no real pattern to that in terms of what each year was relative to the other in terms of how cold and wet and dry and hot it was. But we have a good span here. And maybe more of the white dots are down here in the cool and wet, and maybe more of the black dots are up here, but no real pattern. But let's look at it another way. So what we have here, the size of the balloon is proportional to the number of fires. And this is just for federal lands. So in that same climate space, you can see I do need to go back and point out, 2016 was in fact the hottest and driest year on record in that 50-year time span. So climate change may have had a thing to play here. Okay, so now if we look at the number of fires on federal lands, the size of the bubble seems to get a little bit bigger the further up on the dry and hot side, right? Everybody see that? Now, look at this. Not just the count, but the number of acres that got burned in each year. And just get ready. I'm glad you're all sitting down. That thing looks like a Death Star to me for 2016, right? And there are people in this room who were involved in fighting those fires, and they will argue cogently about the fact that the way we addressed those fires and decided to fight them and whether to let them burn or whether to really try to do an attack on them differs between those years. Like the way we fight fire has changed from 1970 to 2016. But all I'm saying is that if you've got the hottest and driest year on record, and those continue to accumulate, you're liable to have more and more large fires into the future, okay? So that's the 2016 context. So we specifically want to talk about the Rock Mountain Fire. This is up near Tate City, well, some of y'all know it well, up near Clayton, Georgia, just west of Clayton. And so what you see here, this is a burn severity map. And you can see that most of the 24,000 acres kind of came out in that low severity category. I have real issues with the ways burn severity maps are produced, particularly for eastern ecosystems. We can talk about that later. But in reality, a lot of this was more severely burned than it appears. So the red line here, I don't know how well y'all can see it, that's the boundary of the fire. And what we did was we put plots on the unburned side and on the burned side, and we wanted to span this gradient of forest type. And so if I say ectomycorrhizal fungi, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Raise a hand. Again, about maybe up to half this time. So we're going to spend some time on microbiology too. But so different trees have different associations with different fungi, and they have predictable characteristics in terms of the fuel they produce and the flammability of that fuel and several other characteristics. So we'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. Anyway, the way to think about it is there's one type of mycorrhizal associate tree that is mesophytic. Your poplars, maples, sweet gum, those are all AM fungi. And then the trees that are on the other end are your oaks and hickories and pines. Those are ectomycorrhizal fungal associates. We'll go into it more. But we wanted to have a gradient of those because we think they respond differently to fire. The oaks and hickories and pines are all fire adapted, right? Can I get a head bob? Yes. The other ones are supposed to be not fire adapted or fire intolerant, right? Just wait. Okay, so here we are, fire tolerant species. So the fire promoters, we call them in our group. So these are your oaks and hickories. They have recalcitrant litter. That means the litter accumulates. So when it is unburned, it forms duff. You get a heavy duff layer under trees like oaks and pines and hickories, okay? It's more flammable. They have the ectomycorrhizal fungal thing, slow decomposition, duff accumulation. I hit all those points. So you can see the duff layer here in this little drawing. On the other hand, you've got fire intolerant species, and there's a process going on in the Eastern Appalachians called mesification, where we know that there's a shift occurring from those fire tolerant ones to the fire intolerant ones. That's happening. It's been happening over the last 80 years. Why? Probably because they're not being burned often enough. Anyway, so this litter is what we call labile. That means it decomposes very quickly. You don't get a duff accumulation because it all decomposes in a year for various reasons. For one thing, the soil invertebrates really think it's delicious and they eat it first. They have this arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal association, no duff accumulation, and the litter is less flammable. So all of y'all who've been in the woods in hardwood fire situation, you know that the litter of a maple tree or a poplar tree, once it gets wet, it kind of laminates. It forms layers that just don't want to burn, right? But when you are in an oak stand, those litters, when that litter dries up, it curls up, right? And is really aerated. And that's why it burns better, among other reasons. Does everybody already know all this stuff? Okay, so I made this cartoon. Why does mycorrhizal fungal association matter? That's a good question to ask. So if we're talking about an oak hickory stand that's not had fire in it for a long time, what you end up with is a duff layer. Everybody's seen this. It's true for pines too. We're focusing on oak and hickory because that's what we had at Rock Mountain. And over time, over decades of time, the trees aren't dumb. Like they know where the moisture is. They know where the nutrients are, and it's in the duff. So what do? They move their roots into that duff. And they're actively exploring that space for nutrients and water, right? On the other hand, if you've got a poplar maple fire suppressed stand, if it hasn't been burned, who cares? There's no duff. You don't get any roots in that duff, or very little, right? So when you get a wildfire, these roots that used to be happily living their lives in the duff are now either burned up or left high and dry. That situation does not happen when you're under a poplar or maple stand. So what this represents, when you get a lot of your fine roots burned up and you can no longer take up water efficiently and you can no longer take up nutrients efficiently, that's a bad physiological hit. So counterintuitively, maybe, when you get a wildfire in a stand of fire-adapted trees, the ones that are fire tolerant and that we think are closely associated with fire, it actually hurts them more than it does these trees, the poplars and maples. And that's a cartoon, right? That's great. I made a cartoon, but we also have data. But before that, this is what it looked like. This is the Rock Mountain wildfire. And it looks very similar to what was shown earlier for those oak woodlands, right? These are like, 10, 12-inch flame lengths, flame heights. This is a back-end fire. But your first clue, if you've ever been up there, is when you see it burning under rhododendron maximum, it's dry, right? And so it's not just the leaf litter that's burning up, it's also the duff. And I got some pictures to show what that looks like. So you can see the base of this, a pine tree. I mean, there was 6, 8 inches of duff around that tree that's now gone. It's like, we call it, it's like forest gingivitis. Like it's just been receded. Oh, sorry. And the same kind of thing, this is another view of it. It's not like just wholesale, but you get like these little, it's a very interesting like reticulated pattern that kind of develops around some trees. But the bottom line is roots are being consumed, duff is being consumed, and that's a heavy physiological hit for the trees. So here's the data I promised you. What does wildfire do to duff? It burns it. It's not right. So I've got a colleague, her parents are Swedish, so she doesn't like really understand English that well. Louise Loudermilk, you guys know Louise? She messes up all the little sayings. So like I say it's not rocket science. She would say it's not rocket surgery. Like she confuses the brain surgery one with the rocket science one. All right, anyway. So if you look at this gradient again, so we're going from maple poplar to oak hickory, and you look at the amount of duff. So the blue lines are the unburned ones, and the red lines are the burned ones. We've got plots all along that gradient. You can see the further out you get the oak hickory, the more the duff gets consumed because there's more of it to consume in the first place. Okay, so that's not rocket surgery. What does it do to the canopy? So this thing right here, these data are from 3 years after the fire. So it doesn't happen right away. Like a lot of people say, oh, well, you get a hot fire around a tree, it causes an embolism and the tree dies. This is not an embolism. The trees were fine. They flushed leaves the next year. They flushed leaves the year after that. And then the third year, they died. Right? And so this is a little hard to interpret, but what we're looking at here is the percent of the crown remaining. So 75% or more, the probability that we observed 75% or more crown in the stand drops off dramatically the further out you get on the oak hickory axis. So in other words, if you've got 100% oak, you got about a 40% chance that the crown is dead in that stand if it started as 40% oak. So this is a little bit counterintuitive that the oaks, the hickories, the trees that we think are fire adapted are the ones who are actually dying in this fire. Whereas if you're out here on this end, if you're in a predominantly maple or poplar stand, it's 100% crown. They didn't care at all. Anyway, y'all can chew on that and ask me questions about it later if you want. Okay, so to conclude from the Rock Mountain, this is our wildfire part. Tree mortality and canopy decline were predicted by the species identity, that's the tree and their associate with mycorrhizal fungi. And again, we've talked about this a couple of times. It was surprising to us that the fire tolerant species were the ones that took the hit. And we got to sort more out, of course. Okay, so moving on to the prescribed fire one. This is a long-term study. This is not in Georgia, I'm sorry. This is just over the line in North Carolina. The Green River Game Lands near Hendersonville. I guess it's a little bit more than just over the line. In any case, this was a big study and part of a national study. We had 13 sites across the country. A few of them were in the east. And this is, again, kind of mixed oak hickory with increasing component of poplar and maple. And we had this treatment grid where we either burned it or didn't burn it or burned it, and then either had a mechanical removal of the understory. So in this case, we were focusing on Kalmia and rhododendron, just trying to get those ladder fuels and the ericoid mycorrhizal species out of the mix because we think they're influencing the eventual regeneration of the stands there. All right, so these have been repeated, these treatments, the mechanical treatments repeated twice since 2001, and it's been burned now 5 times since 2001. So the question is, can we use the fire and or a fire and mechanical combination to try and encourage the regrowth and advanced stocking of seedlings of the desirable species like oaks and hickories? Okay, so there's been a lot of papers published on this. It started 20 years ago, so you'd hope so. But the findings from the 2016 wildfires inspired us to kind of reanalyze it in terms of, well, okay, it's me. We're going to talk about duff. So we conducted a reanalysis of the original data, and we're basically focusing on partly tree species composition at the beginning, but our principal metric was looking at the amount of change or the delta in conditions, various variables from 2001 to 2015 or 2018. And so Melanie has written up a manuscript detailing these results too, but here's some of the data. All right, so everybody clear on our control, on our treatment structure. We had a control, we had mechanical only, which was removal of the rhododendron and stuff. We had fire only, and then we had a thing that involved both. And these are on about 20-acre plots, replicated 3 times. So what you see, we're looking for mostly for a reduction in basal area. One of the original goals was to try to move it towards a woodland type habitat. So to do that, we've already learned today, you got to remove some of the overstory. But if you're doing it on a large scale, you can't do hack and squirt on, whatever it would be, 10,000 acres or whatever. So we're not doing that. We're just doing a mechanical treatment one or 2 times, right? And so in order to reduce basal area, the only treatment combination that actually achieved that in our scenario here is the mechanical plus fire. And I apologize to y'all. I'm like I told you, I'm an egghead. This basal area is meters squared per hectare, which is not intuitive probably to anybody in this room except for me. So I've tried to help. That 1 square meter of basal area is 10 square feet of basal area, but I forgot that it's still in hectares. So 8 square meters of basal area is 86 square feet, but you got to divide that by 2.4 to get it down to acres, square feet per acre. Sorry. The point is that we did reduce, and it was a significant reduction in basal area, but only in that one treatment. All right. So what did that do to recruitment of the species that we want and or mortality of the overstory? Our treatments resulted, the fire treatment was not different from the control of the mechanical. They were not different from each other, but the mechanical plus fire, we did see some overstory mortality. It was in much lower rates than what we saw in the wildfire though. So when land managers go to a place that you've put a prescribed fire into and there's dead trees, they're like, what have you done? In a lot of cases, they don't want to see that, right? They're looking, they want to see the live tree on the stump. But we did manage to kill a few, so we thought, good, this is going to open up the canopy a little bit. We're going to move it towards the woodland thing and maybe encourage some recruits of the species that we want. But if you look at the recruitment of trees into those treatments, they're exactly the same in all of them. We got about the same amount of recruitment in all of them. And when I say tree, that is a tree that moved from a sapling size class to 10 centimeter DBH, 4-inch DBH. All right, what does repeated prescribed fire do to the duff? Well, it burns it, even if you do it under prescriptions that are intended not to really burn up too much of the duff, right? So in our mechanical plus fire, we had a reduction in duff depth, just a couple of centimeters, but we think that over time, this may be moving it in the right direction, at least in terms of mitigating the risk to the overstory trees, to wildfire occurrence, right? And then that was less so in the fire treatment, but also significantly different from the controls. So we're moving it in the right direction in terms of opening the canopy and reducing duff depth. Okay, how much time do I have, y'all? Have I gone way over? Eric? Okay. I wanted to say at the beginning that I've prepared a short 2-hour presentation to close out the session. Okay, so another question we asked, what does the future forest look like if we continue these treatments, right? And so the answer is not a lot different from what it looks like in the control plots. But we did see in the fire-only plot a really sort of disappointing pattern, which is that acer, which is your maple species, are actually more abundant in the fire-only plots than the quercus ones are, than the oaks are. Those are our 2 most abundant genera in those plots. Now, if you look and you kind of hold your mouth right and wish really hard, you can see that there's more oaks in the seedling layer, like maybe more, but it's not statistically significant. The only statistically significant thing we had was more maples in the fire-only treatment. So are we moving it in the right direction or not? It's an outstanding question. So what does the future forest look like if we continue the fire and fire surrogate treatments? Part 2 is a little more encouraging. So what we're looking at here is the number of seedlings that are in the right genus. So Quercus, the green line. If you look at the ones where we reduced the basal area the most, each of these are individual plots. So the plots where basal area was reduced of the overstory, in other words, the ones where we had the most impact with our original treatments, those are the ones where the oaks are really dominating, right? And if you look at the acer line, the maple line, it's flat. They don't benefit from greater opening size. This is just showing it by treatment. This is by species. So the take-home message is maybe we're moving it in the right direction, but let's move to the next slide. So management implications, like people who manage land want to know what to do, right? And so, and scientists are always like, well, wait till the next experiment's done. And that may not be very useful. So I've tried to talk about what management implications might be. So these repeated fires are effective. We showed with data that you can reduce the duff layer with repeated fire alone or with mechanical treatment. But if you only do it every 5 years, it doesn't produce the desired mix of species recruits, desired mix of species that you want in the recruitment layer, right? So maybe we need to burn more often. Duff could be reduced more with more frequent fires, and that seems like something, that's a drum we've been beating all day. Burn it more, as often as you can, even in the mountains. We might be able to, so the way I think about this is like duff is an animal that has to be fed, and it's being fed from above by leaf litter, and it's being fed from below by roots. And if you can starve it of one of those major building blocks, i.e. the litter, by burning it off every 2 years, you can make the duff layer, you can starve it down to nothing. It takes time, probably take 20 years. I need to like make an empirical model to describe that, but I think that frequent fire is the answer, really. And so our fire and fire surrogate treatments, these mechanical and prescribed fire treatments, may halt the process of mesification. Like we may be producing enough oak recruits in these treatments to make it so that the future forest has more oaks than maples, but maybe not. So it may be possible that even more active management may be needed, like herbicide of the trees that you don't want, and or the shrubs that we're trying to get rid of too, because they resprout. And maybe if you spray them or do a hack and squirt or something, you can be more effective at opening up that ground layer so that you get more tree recruits. And so my final closing remark here is that, and it's already been said, fire is inevitable. Like all you got to do is look at the climatological data from 2016 to see that, you know, conditions are produced every now and then that are going to cause fires, whether you want them or not, right? And so one way to get ourselves out of the problem of burning up duff when we don't want to is to make sure that there's not any there to begin with by frequently burning these systems. I think that's it. Yeah, it is. All these people, so Melanie in particular, right? That's mostly her data. Nina Wurzberger, who's a colleague at Georgia, Don Hagan at Clemson, Adam Coates at Virginia Tech. Like this is a large group of people who've been contributing to this. All the way down the list, there's people that didn't make the list because I ran out of room. But our colleagues on the National Forest who've made it possible for us to do this work, you know, hopefully it's made a decent return for your investment. And hopefully it'll help us guide management of these forests into the future. I got a whole other one we could do talking about pine, but I ran out of time. And I have to show this. USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.